Picture this. The year is 711 CE. A small force of warriors stands at the edge of Africa, gazing across the narrow strait toward Europe. Their commander, a Berber general named Tariq ibn Ziyad, is about to make a decision that will change the course of Western civilization forever. Within months, these men will control vast kingdoms. Within decades, they'll build one of the most advanced civilizations the world has ever seen. And for the next 800 years, Muslim rule will transform Europe in ways that still echo through our world today. Most people think of Europe as exclusively Christian territory throughout history. But here's the truth they don't teach in most schools. For nearly 8 centuries, vast portions of Europe were governed by Muslim rulers. From the sun-drenched shores of Spain and Portugal to the mountains of Sicily, from the Balkans to the gates of Vienna, Islamic civilization left an indelible mark on European soil. This isn't just ancient history gathering dust in forgotten books. This is a story of incredible military conquests that nobody saw coming. Golden ages of knowledge when Muslim capitals outshone anything Christian Europe had to offer. Architectural marvels that still stand today, making tourists gasp in wonder, and a clash of civilizations that shaped the modern world in ways you probably never realized. So buckle up, because over the next 2 hours, we're going on an epic journey. We'll witness the lightning conquest of Spain that transformed a kingdom overnight. We'll walk through the streets of Córdoba, when it was the most advanced city in all of Europe. We'll discover the forgotten history of Muslim Sicily and southern Italy. We'll watch as Ottoman armies march deep into the heart of Europe, reaching the gates of Vienna itself. And we'll see how Islamic civilization influenced everything from the food you eat to the numbers you use, from the words you speak to the buildings you admire. By the end of this video, you'll understand how Europe's history is far more interconnected with Islamic civilization than most people realize. The story you're about to hear will challenge what you thought you knew about European history. So let's begin this incredible journey into a past that most history books barely mention. To understand how Muslims came to rule Spain, we need to first understand what Spain looked like in the year 710 CE. The Iberian Peninsula wasn't the unified Spain we know today with its clear borders and single government. No, it was ruled by the Visigoths, a Germanic tribe that had swept down from the north after the collapse of the mighty Roman Empire. Think about that for a moment. Rome, which had ruled the known world for centuries, had fallen. And in its place, across Europe, barbarian tribes carved out their own kingdoms. The Visigoths got Spain. But by the early 8th century, the Visigothic kingdom was crumbling from within like a house with termites eating away at its foundations. King Witiza had died in 710, and what followed was a succession crisis that would make a modern soap opera look tame. The throne was seized by Roderick, a powerful nobleman who basically said, "I'm taking over, deal with it." But not everyone dealt with it. Witiza's sons and their supporters were furious. They believed the throne was rightfully theirs. The kingdom fractured into factions. Noble families that should have been defending the realm were instead plotting against each other. The army was divided. The people were overtaxed and unhappy. It was the perfect storm of dysfunction. Meanwhile, just across the narrow Strait of Gibraltar in North Africa, something very different was happening. The Islamic Umayyad Caliphate had been expanding at a pace that would make Alexander the Great jealous. Under Caliph al-Walid I, Muslim forces had conquered an empire stretching from Persia in the east to the Atlantic Ocean in the west. They had defeated the mighty Persian Empire. They had taken Byzantine territories that had stood for centuries. They had brought all of North Africa under Islamic rule. The governor of Ifriqiya, which covered modern-day Tunisia and Algeria, was a brilliant Arab commander named Musa ibn Nusayr. He had just finished pacifying the Berber tribes of North Africa, which wasn't easy because the Berbers were fierce warriors who had resisted Roman, Vandal, and Byzantine rule for centuries. But Musa succeeded where others had failed. The secret? The Islamic message resonated with the Berbers in a way previous conquerors' messages never had. Islam preached equality before God regardless of race or tribal origin. For Berber tribes who had been treated as second-class subjects by Romans and Byzantines, this was revolutionary. Many converted, and they would soon play a starring role in what was about to unfold. Now here's where the story gets really interesting. The Muslims weren't initially planning a full-scale conquest of Spain. What happened next was a combination of opportunity, political intrigue, and one of the boldest military gambles in history. According to historical accounts that come down to us from both Christian and Muslim chroniclers, a Byzantine noble named Julian, who served as the governor of Ceuta on the North African coast, reached out to Musa ibn Nusayr. The story goes that Julian's daughter had been sent to the Visigothic court, as was customary for nobles, to be educated, but King Roderick allegedly dishonored her. Julian, enraged and seeking revenge, supposedly invited the Muslims to invade Spain, offering to help them. Now, historians have debated this story for centuries. Some think it's true, others think it's a legend created later to explain the conquest. But what we know for certain from multiple sources is that someone from within Visigothic Spain, someone with detailed knowledge of the kingdom's military strength and political divisions, provided intelligence to the Muslims and encouraged them to attack. Whether it was Julian or someone else, the point is the same. Spain's internal enemies opened the door. Musa ibn Nusayr was a cautious commander. He didn't just invade blindly. First, in the summer of 710, he sent a small reconnaissance force of about 400 men, under a commander named Tarif ibn Malik, to probe Spain's defenses. Think of it as a test run. Tarif and his men crossed the strait in 4 ships, raided the southern coast of Spain near Gibraltar, captured some prisoners and loot, and made it back safely. They brought valuable intelligence. The coast was vulnerable, the local garrisons were weak, and there was clear evidence of political chaos in the Visigothic kingdom. The time was right for something bigger. In April 711 CE, Musa assembled a larger force under the command of Tariq ibn Ziyad. Now, Tariq's story itself is fascinating. He was a Berber, possibly a former slave, who had been freed and risen through the ranks through his military skill and leadership. This tells you something important about early Islamic society. Social mobility was possible in ways that weren't common in many other civilizations of the time. A freed Berber slave could command armies and change history. The size of Tariq's force is debated by historians. Some early sources claim he had just 1,700 men initially, then received reinforcements bringing the total to about 7,000. Other sources suggest up to 12,000, but even taking the highest estimates, this was not a massive army. It was primarily composed of Berber warriors who had recently converted to Islam, with a smaller number of Arab troops providing leadership and expertise. These were tough, battle-hardened men, many of them veterans of the campaigns in North Africa. Tariq's fleet crossed the Strait of Gibraltar, which is only about 14 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. On a clear day, you can see across it. They landed at the foot of a massive limestone rock that jutted dramatically out from the southern tip of Spain, a rock that dominated the landscape and would serve as a natural fortress. Tariq and his men made camp there. That rock would forever bear his name, Jabal al-Tariq, meaning Mountain of Tariq, which over the centuries evolved in Spanish pronunciation into Gibraltar. Think about the audacity of this moment. Put yourself in Tariq's sandals. You're a Berber commander leading an army of 7,000 men, most of them your fellow Berbers, invading a European kingdom. You're thousands of miles from your base in North Africa. You're crossing water with no guarantee you can retreat. You're about to face a kingdom that, despite its problems, still has armies, fortified cities, and vastly greater numbers than you. The odds of success? Not great. Legend says that Tariq, after his forces landed, burned his ships. Most modern historians think this probably didn't actually happen, or at least didn't happen the way the legend claims. But the story became famous because Tariq supposedly gave a speech to his troops that was recorded by later chroniclers. He said something like, "Men, the enemy is before you, and the sea is behind you. There is nowhere to run. You have only the enemy's swords ahead or the sea's waves behind. You cannot escape. You can only fight and win or die trying." Whether he actually burned the ships and gave exactly that speech, we can't know for certain. But the message was clear, and it became part of Islamic military legend. This was a one-way mission, victory or martyrdom, no retreat, no backup plan, win or die. The The Muslims began their campaign by capturing the town of Algeciras, then started moving northward, taking smaller towns and fortresses one by one. And here's something fascinating that often gets overlooked. Many local populations didn't actually resist very hard. Why? Because the Visigothic nobles who ruled Spain were hated by large segments of the population. They made up only about 1 or 2% of Spain's people, yet they owned most of the land, controlled all the power, and taxed everyone else mercilessly. The majority population, Hispano-Romans who were descendants of the people Rome had ruled for centuries, had little love for their Visigothic overlords. Jewish communities, in particular, had suffered terribly under Visigothic rule. The Visigoths had converted to Catholic Christianity and became fanatical about religious conformity. Jews were persecuted, forced to convert, and had their children taken away to be raised Christian. When Muslim forces arrived offering protected status for people of the book, promising that Jews could keep their religion, their synagogues, and their property if they just paid a tax, many Jewish communities actively welcomed the invaders. In some towns, Jews helped the Muslims by providing intelligence, supplies, and even taking over garrison duties so Muslim forces could move on to the next target. News of the invasion reached King Roderick, who was campaigning in the northern part of Spain, trying to suppress a Basque rebellion. He immediately rushed south, gathering his forces as he went. Historical sources vary wildly on the numbers. Some chronicles claim Roderick assembled an army of 100,000 men. Modern historians think that's probably a huge exaggeration, and the real number was more like 25,000 to 30,000 troops. But even at the lower estimate, Roderick's army significantly outnumbered Tariq's Muslims, probably by at least 3 or 4 to 1. The two armies met in July 711 at a location somewhere near the Guadalete River in southern Spain. We don't know the exact battlefield location even today, which adds to its mystery and legend. The battle raged for several days. Medieval chronicles describe clouds of dust so thick that soldiers couldn't see the sun, the thunder of thousands of hooves, the clash of steel on steel, screams of wounded men and horses, blood turning the ground to mud. But here's what made this battle truly pivotal. Roderick had a fatal weakness in his army. Remember those supporters of the previous king, Witiza, who felt Roderick had stolen the throne? Many of them commanded sections of Roderick's army. They were supposed to be fighting for their king, but their loyalty was questionable at best. At the crucial moment of the battle, when the fighting was fiercest and the outcome hung in the balance, they betrayed Roderick. Some sources say they simply withdrew from the fight, leaving Roderick's center exposed. Other sources claim they actively switched sides and attacked their own king's forces from behind. Either way, it was catastrophic. Roderick's army collapsed. Men who had been fighting the Muslims suddenly found themselves being attacked from multiple directions. Panic spread. Formations broke. It became a rout. Soldiers threw down their weapons and fled, and King Roderick himself died in the chaos. His body was never found, though some sources claim they found his horse and royal cloak by a river, suggesting he drowned trying to escape. The Battle of Guadalete changed everything in an afternoon. The Visigothic kingdom's entire military leadership was wiped out. The king was dead. The army was destroyed. There was no chain of command, no organization, no way to mount effective resistance. The kingdom was essentially decapitated in a single blow. Tariq, seeing this incredible opportunity opening before him, didn't rest on his victory. He immediately sent word to Musa ibn Nusayr in North Africa, "Send reinforcements. All of Spain is within our grasp." Then he split his relatively small army into multiple columns and began one of the most audacious campaigns in military history. One column, commanded by a lieutenant named Mughith al-Rumi, marched on Córdoba, one of the most important cities in the peninsula. The city's garrison tried to defend it, but they were overwhelmed. Córdoba fell. Another column took Granada, another major city. Meanwhile, Tariq himself led the main force toward Toledo, the Visigothic capital. Think about this for a moment. Tariq had maybe 7,000 men, and he was splitting them up to attack multiple cities simultaneously while marching on the enemy capital. This should have been suicide. He was outnumbered everywhere, spreading his forces thin, penetrating deep into enemy territory with no supply lines secured. Every military manual ever written says, "Don't do this." But it worked because the Visigothic kingdom was so paralyzed by shock and internal division that they couldn't organize a coordinated response. Toledo, the proud capital of the Visigothic kingdom, fell in late 711 with surprisingly little resistance. The nobles who might have organized a defense were either dead at Guadalete or too busy plotting against each other to unite against the invaders. The city's treasures, accumulated over centuries, fell into Muslim hands. The psychological impact was enormous. If even Toledo, the capital, could fall so easily, what hope did anywhere else have? In 712, Musa ibn Nusayr himself arrived from North Africa with reinforcements, bringing about 18,000 fresh troops, mostly Arab soldiers from Syria and the Arabian Peninsula. There was initially tension between Musa and Tariq. Some historical sources suggest Musa was jealous of Tariq's success. After all, Tariq was supposed to be conducting a limited raid, not conquering an entire kingdom. One account claims Musa was so angry he struck Tariq with a whip and scolded him for overstepping his orders. But personal drama aside, they combined their forces and continued the conquest with devastating efficiency. Together, Musa and Tariq methodically conquered the rest of the peninsula like chess players moving pieces across a board. Seville, one of Spain's largest and wealthiest cities, fell. Merida, with its strong fortifications, held out longer but finally surrendered in the summer of 712 after a prolonged siege. The city of Zaragoza in the northeast submitted. In the southeast, a Visigothic noble named Theudemir, seeing which way the wind was blowing, negotiated a treaty rather than fight, in exchange for paying jizya, the tax on non-Muslims, and pledging loyalty to the new Muslim rulers. He was allowed to keep his lands, his title, and continue governing his territory. His subjects could keep their churches and practice Christianity freely. This Treaty of Theudemir set an important precedent that would be repeated across Spain, rather than completely destroying the existing social structure, which would have been expensive in blood and treasure. The Muslims often allowed local Christian nobles to keep ruling if they submitted peacefully and paid tribute. This pragmatic approach meant that large portions of Spain were conquered without extensive bloodshed or destruction. Cities that surrendered kept their churches, their properties, their local governments. They just paid taxes to Muslim overlords instead of Visigothic ones. For many common people, especially those who had been heavily taxed by the Visigoths, this was actually an improvement. By 714 CE, virtually all of the Iberian Peninsula, except for small Christian kingdoms in the far northern mountains, places like Asturias in the Cantabrian Mountains and the Basque regions in the Pyrenees, was under Muslim control. Read that again. In less than 3 years, an entire kingdom had fallen to a relatively small invading force. It was one of the fastest conquests in history, and it would shape European history for the next 800 years. But the Muslims didn't stop at Spain. Momentum and the logic of expansion pushed them forward. Muslim forces crossed the Pyrenees Mountains into what is now southern France, called Septimania at the time. They took the city of Narbonne in 720. They raided deep into southern France, capturing cities, taking plunder, spreading fear. For a moment it seemed like nothing could stop their advance into the heart of Christian Europe. In 732, a Muslim army under the command of Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi penetrated deep into Francia, reaching as far north as Tours, which is not far from Paris. There, in October 732, they were finally stopped by the Frankish leader Charles Martel and his army at the Battle of Tours, sometimes called the Battle of Poitiers. Abdul Rahman was killed in the battle, and his army retreated back to Spain. Many Western historians call the Battle of Tours one of the most decisive battles in world history, claiming that if the Muslims had won, all of Europe might have fallen to Islam. That's probably an exaggeration, as the Muslim forces were on an extended raid far from their bases, not a conquest campaign. But the battle did mark the furthest point of Muslim expansion into Western Europe. Here's what's undeniable, though. While they didn't conquer France, the Muslims had conquered Spain, and they would hold most of it for nearly 800 years. Let me repeat that because it's worth letting sink in. Muslims ruled most of Spain for 800 years. That's longer than the United States has existed. That's as long as from the time of the Crusades to today. This wasn't a brief occupation. This was centuries of Islamic civilization on European soil. So why did Spain fall so quickly? Historians have pondered this question for over 1,000 years. How did a force of 7,000 men conquer an entire kingdom in 3 years? First and foremost, political division. The Visigothic kingdom was a house divided against itself. The disputed succession created hostile factions that literally turned on each other in the middle of battle. When King Roderick needed unity to face an existential threat, he got betrayal and backstabbing. No kingdom can survive that. Second, military superiority. Despite being outnumbered, the Muslim forces were better organized, better led, and more experienced. Many were veterans of the campaigns in Persia, Syria, Egypt, and North Africa. They had fought the Byzantine Empire and the Persian Empire. They knew logistics, they knew tactics, they knew how to adapt to different enemies and terrain. The Visigothic army, by contrast, was primarily a feudal levy, nobles and their retainers who weren't professional soldiers. In a straight fight, discipline and experience beat numbers. Third, motivation. The Muslim warriors were fighting for both religious and material rewards. Islamic theology promised paradise to those who died in jihad. Success in battle brought wealth from plunder and land grants. This combination of spiritual and material motivation made them formidable. The Visigothic soldiers, meanwhile, were fighting for a king many didn't like, defending a system that oppressed them. Their motivation was much weaker. Fourth, social factors. The Visigothic elite who ruled Spain made up only 1 or 2% of the population. They were a thin ruling class sitting atop a much larger population of Hispano-Romans, Jews, and others who had little loyalty to them. Heavy taxation, religious persecution, and arbitrary rule by the aristocracy meant that when invaders arrived offering better terms, many locals didn't fight to preserve the old order. Some actively helped the invaders. Fifth, religious tolerance. The Muslims granted protected status to people of the book, meaning Christians and Jews. Yes, they had to pay jizya, a special tax. Yes, there were some restrictions on building new churches and public displays of faith. But they could keep their religion, their houses of worship, their property, their communities. For Jews who had faced forced conversions and persecution under the Visigoths, this was actually a huge improvement. For Christians, it was at least tolerable, especially compared to the chaos of war. Sixth, speed and psychological momentum. Once Roderick fell at Guadalete and Toledo was taken, psychological momentum shifted entirely. The capital had fallen, the king was dead. Who was going to organize resistance? Each city that surrendered made the next city more likely to surrender too, because it became clear that resistance was futile. Success bred success. The Muslim conquest of Spain wasn't just a military campaign that historians study. It was one of the most significant geopolitical events in medieval history, and it set the stage for what would become one of the greatest civilizations Europe had ever seen. But before we get to the Golden Age, we need to understand what happened in the decades after the initial conquest, because it wasn't all smooth sailing. After the conquest, Spain, or as the Muslims called it, Al-Andalus, a name whose origin is debated but possibly comes from the Vandals who had ruled parts of Spain before the Visigoths, became a province of the Umayyad Caliphate based in Damascus, Syria. Governors were appointed from Damascus to rule this new western frontier of the Islamic world. But in 750 CE, far away in Damascus, a revolution erupted that would change everything. The Umayyad dynasty, which had ruled the Islamic world since shortly after the Prophet Muhammad's death, was overthrown in a bloody coup by a rival family called the Abbasids. It wasn't just a change of government. It was a massacre. The Abbasids hunted down every member of the Umayyad family they could find and killed them, including women and children. They dug up the graves of dead Umayyad caliphs and desecrated their remains. They wanted to erase the Umayyads from history. But one Umayyad prince escaped, Abd al-Rahman ibn Muawiyah. He was just 20 years old when the massacres began. The story of his escape is the stuff of legend. When Abbasid assassins came to his family's estate along the Euphrates River, Abd al-Rahman and his younger brother were swimming. His brother, terrified, tried to swim back when the assassins called out, promising they wouldn't hurt them. Abd al-Rahman screamed at his brother not to trust them, but the boy swam back anyway. The assassins grabbed him and beheaded him right there before Abd al-Rahman's eyes while he watched helplessly from the water. Abd al-Rahman dove beneath the surface and swam until his lungs were burning, putting as much distance as possible between himself and the killers. He made it to the far bank and ran. Thus began 6 years on the run, moving from village to village across North Africa, constantly one step ahead of Abbasid agents who were hunting him. He survived by disguising himself, relying on the kindness of sympathetic tribal leaders, and moving constantly. Most men would have given up or been caught. Abd al-Rahman was neither a quitter nor a fool. In 755, Abd al-Rahman crossed the strait into Spain. There he saw an opportunity. Al-Andalus was politically unstable, with Arab and Berber factions fighting each other for control. The governors sent from Damascus had never been particularly effective, and now with the Abbasid revolution, there was confusion about who even had legitimate authority. Abd al-Rahman used his family name, still respected among Umayyad loyalists and supporters, to gather followers. He was, after all, the legitimate heir to the Umayyad dynasty, even if that dynasty had been overthrown everywhere else. In 756, after a brief military campaign, Abd al-Rahman defeated the Abbasid-appointed governor and declared himself emir of Córdoba. Not caliph, that title he saved for later. For now he was emir, the commander, the prince. He established an independent emirate, refusing to recognize the Abbasid caliphs in Baghdad who had murdered his family. From 756 to 929, Al-Andalus would be ruled by the Emirate of Córdoba, independent of the Abbasid Caliphate in the east. Abd al-Rahman I, as he's known to history, ruled for over 30 years and laid the foundations for what would become one of the greatest civilizations in medieval Europe. He began construction of the Great Mosque of Córdoba in 784, which would become one of the architectural wonders of the medieval world. He brought stability to Al-Andalus, crushed his rivals and established a functioning government, but he always remembered his murdered family. Historians say he never truly smiled again after watching his brother's execution. He was known as al-Dakhil, the immigrant, because he was a refugee who became a ruler. His descendants continued to rule and expand Al-Andalus for generations, but the Golden Age truly began 174 years after Abd al-Rahman I's arrival, with Abd al-Rahman III, who came to power in 912. Abd al-Rahman III ruled for nearly 50 years, from 912 to 961, and his reign represents the absolute peak of Al-Andalus's power and prosperity. In 929, he took a revolutionary step that his predecessors had avoided. He declared himself not just emir, but caliph. This was a bold, even audacious move. There was already a caliph in Baghdad, the Abbasid caliph, and there was a rival caliph in Cairo, the Fatimid caliph. By declaring himself caliph, Abd al-Rahman III was saying, "We are not subordinate to Baghdad or anyone else. We are equals." Al-Andalus is an independent Islamic empire with its own caliph, its own legitimacy, its own destiny. And under his rule and that of his successors, Córdoba would become arguably the greatest city in Europe. Let me paint you a picture of what Córdoba was like in the 10th century, because most people today have no idea. In the year 950, while most of Europe was struggling through what we call the Dark Ages, Córdoba was shining like a beacon. The city had a population estimated at somewhere between 100,000 and 500,000 people. Historians debate the exact figure, but even taking the lower estimates, Córdoba was massive. For comparison, Paris at the same time had maybe 20,000 to 25,000 people. London was a small town of perhaps 10,000. Rome had declined to maybe 50,000. Only Constantinople in the Christian world could rival Córdoba in size. But it wasn't just the size that was impressive. It was what the city contained. Córdoba had paved streets, not muddy dirt paths like most medieval European cities. Those streets were lit at night by oil lamps, making Córdoba one of the few cities in the world where you could walk safely after dark. The city had running water supplied by aqueducts that brought water from the mountains. It had an advanced sewage system that carried waste out of the city rather than dumping it in the streets like was common elsewhere. The city contained hundreds of public baths, maybe as many as 700 according to some sources, where people could bathe regularly. This is significant because in Christian Europe at this time, public bathing was rare. Many medieval Europeans bathed only a few times a year, if that. The church was suspicious of public baths, associating them with Roman decadence and potential immorality. But in Muslim Córdoba, cleanliness was next to godliness. Islam requires ritual washing before prayers 5 times a day, so public baths were everywhere and people used them regularly. The city had parks and gardens with exotic plants from across the Islamic world. It had a zoo with animals from Africa and Asia that most Europeans had never even heard of. It had bustling markets where goods from 3 continents were bought and sold. Spices from India, silk from China, gold from West Africa, amber from the Baltic, ivory from East Africa, furs from Russia. Córdoba was a global trading hub connecting the Islamic world with Christian Europe and beyond. And the city contained 700 mosques according to medieval geographers who visited. The centerpiece was the Great Mosque of Córdoba, begun by Abd al-Rahman I and expanded by his successors into an absolutely stunning architectural achievement. You can still visit it today, though it's been converted into a cathedral. When you walk inside, you're met with a forest of columns, over 850 of them, with distinctive red and white, striped arches, creating a mesmerizing pattern that seems to go on forever. Light filters through, creating shadows and illumination that shift throughout the day. It's one of the most beautiful buildings in the world, and even medieval Christian chroniclers who hated Muslims admitted the mosque was breathtaking. But what truly made Córdoba exceptional was knowledge, books, learning, education, science, philosophy, medicine. This wasn't just a rich city, it was an intellectual powerhouse, unlike anything Europe had seen since the fall of Rome. Caliph al-Hakam II, who ruled from 961 to 976, was a bibliophile, a book collector and lover of learning, who took the pursuit of knowledge to an extreme that seems almost unbelievable. He sent book buyers across the Islamic world with essentially unlimited budgets to purchase manuscripts on every subject imaginable: mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, history, poetry, agriculture, chemistry, geography, theology. His agents traveled to Baghdad, Damascus, Cairo, Constantinople, and beyond, competing with other collectors to acquire rare texts. Al-Hakam II's royal library in Córdoba contained, according to historical sources, 400,000 to 600,000 volumes. Now let me give you context for that number because it's so staggering that it's hard to comprehend. The largest library in Christian Europe at the same time, the Abbey of St. Gall in Switzerland, which was considered one of the greatest libraries in Christendom, had about 100 books, not 100,000. 100 books. 400,000 books in Córdoba versus 100 books in the best Christian library. That's not a typo. That's not an exaggeration. That's the intellectual gulf between Al-Andalus and the rest of Europe in the 10th century. The library was catalogued, meaning there was an index system allowing scholars to find books. Part of the catalog alone reportedly filled 44 volumes. The library employed copyists who made duplicate manuscripts so scholars could borrow books for study. It had translators who translated works from Greek, Persian, Sanskrit, and other languages into Arabic so they would be accessible to more scholars. Al-Hakam II also established 27 free schools in Córdoba. Free education over 1,000 years ago. Children of poor families could attend school and learn to read, write, and do mathematics. By some estimates, the literacy rate in 10th century Córdoba was higher than in most European cities 800 years later during the Industrial Revolution. Women were also educated, which was almost unheard of in medieval Christian Europe. One of the most remarkable figures in Al-Hakam's court was Lubna of Córdoba, a woman who became one of the most learned scholars of her time. She was a mathematician, poet, and expert in grammar and calligraphy. At one point she served as Al-Hakam's personal secretary and was partially responsible for managing his library. Think about that. a woman in a position of scholarly authority and bureaucratic power in the 10th century. That wouldn't happen in Christian Europe for many centuries to come. Students from across Europe and the Islamic world came to Córdoba to study. The city had universities and colleges where you could study medicine, law, mathematics, astronomy, philosophy. Christian monks from France and Germany traveled to Córdoba to access books and knowledge that simply didn't exist anywhere in Christian Europe. Later, during the 12th and 13th centuries, these same scholars would translate Arabic works into Latin, helping to spark the European Renaissance. The knowledge that had been lost when Rome fell, preserved and expanded by Muslim scholars, was transmitted back to Europe through places like Córdoba. Al-Andalus wasn't just preserving knowledge like a museum, they were advancing it, pushing the boundaries of human understanding in every field. In medicine, Al-Zahrawi, known in the West as Abul Qasis, was the greatest surgeon of the medieval period, perhaps of any period before modern times. He lived in Córdoba and wrote a massive 30-volume medical encyclopedia called Al-Tasrif, or the Method of Medicine. This wasn't just theory. It was practical medicine based on his actual surgical experience over decades of practice. The encyclopedia contained detailed descriptions of surgical procedures, illustrations of over 200 surgical instruments he invented or improved, and techniques for everything from removing bladder stones to treating skull fractures, to gynecological procedures, to dental surgery. Many of the instruments Al-Zahrawi designed are still used today, in modified form: forceps, scalpels, surgical needles, and more. His surgical techniques for things like using catgut for internal stitches were revolutionary. His work was translated into Latin in the 12th century and became the standard surgical textbook in Europe for the next 500 years. Think about that. A book written by a Muslim surgeon in 10th century Spain remained the definitive surgical manual in European medical schools until the 1500s. In philosophy, Ibn Rushd, known in the West as Averroes, wrote extensive commentaries on Aristotle that literally reintroduced ancient Greek philosophy to Christian Europe. After the fall of Rome, most Greek philosophical works were lost to Western Europe, but they had been translated into Arabic and preserved by Muslim scholars. Averroes not only preserved Aristotle's works, but provided sophisticated commentaries explaining and interpreting them. When Christian scholars in the 13th century wanted to study Aristotle, they didn't have access to the original Greek texts. They read Averroes's Arabic commentaries translated into Latin. Thomas Aquinas, one of the most important Christian theologians in history, relied heavily on Averroes's interpretations of Aristotle to develop his own philosophy. Dante, in his Divine Comedy, places Averroes in limbo, alongside other virtuous non-Christians, a sign of the respect even medieval Christians had for his intellectual contributions. Islamic scholarship literally transmitted Greek philosophy back to the West. In astronomy, Al-Zarqali, known in the West as Arzachel, revolutionized the field. He invented an improved version of the astrolabe, an instrument used for calculating the positions of celestial bodies, telling time and navigation. His astrolabe was so advanced that it remained the standard design for 500 years. He created astronomical tables called the Toledan tables, which accurately predicted the positions of the sun, moon, and planets. These tables were used by astronomers across Europe and the Islamic world for centuries. Al-Zarqali made observations of the heavens so precise that he correctly determined the orbit of Mercury.